The city Stalin tried to starve. Why did Harry Truman choose to feed a trapped city from the sky instead of sending in tanks or walking away and letting it starve to death? In the summer of 1948, West Berlin was supposed to quietly suffocate. On June 24, 1948, Stalin cut every road, rail line, and waterway leading into the western sectors of the city controlled by the U.S., Britain, and France. Freight trains stopped. Barges were turned around. Power plants supplying electricity to West Berlin were shut off. In a matter of days, more than 2.5 million people were staring at empty coal bunkers, dwindling food stocks, and the very real prospect of hunger and winter in the ruins of a defeated Germany. In Washington, Truman's advisors spelled it out. To break the blockade by force meant risking World War III. To abandon Berlin meant handing Stalin a bloodless victory and showing all of Europe that America's promises were worth nothing. Between nuclear war and humiliation, Truman chose a third option that sounded insane on paper. Save Berlin with airplanes, turn cargo planes into lifelines, fly in every sack of flour, every ton of coal, every drop of medicine the city needed. 24 hours a day. In narrow air corridors the Soviets could close or provoke at any moment. This would be a battle without bullets, fought with bales of wheat, drums of fuel, powdered milk, and chocolate bars. Commanded not by a glamorous general, but by a former haberdasher from Missouri who refused to back down. The Berlin Airlift would become Truman's quiet masterpiece and Stalin's first great defeat of the Cold War. To understand how Truman ended up gambling on such a crazy idea, you have to go back to the ruins of 1945. When Nazi Germany surrendered, the Allies didn't just topple Hitler and go home. They carved the country into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Deep inside the Soviet zone lay the old capital, Berlin, and by Allied agreement, it too was sliced into 4 pieces. That meant a small western enclave, U.S., U.K., and French sectors, sitting like an island hundreds of kilometers inside territory controlled by Stalin. At first, everyone smiled for the cameras. Big 3 victory photos, parades with flags. Talk about building a peaceful new Europe. But between 1945 and 1947, the mood turned cold. Stalin moved quickly to install communist governments across Eastern Europe: Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, creating a belt of states loyal to Moscow. In Washington, Truman and his advisors watched ballots turn into one-party regimes and concluded that Soviet tanks and secret police were replacing Nazi ones. Then came the Marshall Plan in 1947, a massive American program to pour billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. To Washington, it was economic rescue. To Stalin, it looked like a hostile takeover. The dollar buying influence threatening his grip on a shattered continent. And right in the middle of this new fault line sat Berlin. The western sectors, especially West Berlin, depended almost entirely on rail lines and roads that ran through Soviet-controlled East Germany. Every sack of flour, every ton of coal, every box of medicine had to cross territory Stalin controlled. He couldn't yet push American troops out with tanks without risking open war. But he could squeeze slowly by turning off the tap. Berlin was no longer just a ruined German city, it was a pressure point, and both sides knew it. On June 24, 1948, Stalin stopped squeezing and slammed the door. Overnight, Soviet authorities announced that technical difficulties and traffic problems required closing rail lines from the western zones into Berlin. Freight trains were turned back. Trucks were halted at checkpoints. Barges on the canals were refused passage. Within hours, every rail, road, and water route feeding West Berlin from West Germany was shut down. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate blockade. The message to Washington, London, and Paris was simple: abandon your plans or abandon this city. The immediate trigger was a dry technical issue that almost no ordinary Berliner cared about: the introduction of a new Western currency, the Deutsche Mark. In the American, British, and French zones, the old Reichsmark was a chaos of inflation and black markets. Without a stable currency, any hope of rebuilding Germany was doomed. For Stalin, a strong West German economy tied to the U.S. was a nightmare. When the Western powers extended the Deutsche Mark into their sectors of Berlin, he treated it as a direct challenge inside his own zone. The blockade was his answer. But behind the currency dispute was a larger goal: to force the West to admit that Berlin, lying deep inside the Soviet occupation zone, was indefensible. If Truman and his partners accepted the facts on the ground and quietly pulled out, Stalin would gain a huge propaganda victory without firing a shot. Almost immediately, the lights went out. The power plants that supplied electricity to West Berlin sat in the Soviet sector, and that night their output was cut. Streetcars stopped. Refrigerators went warm. Workshops and factories fell silent. Food stocks in the western sectors were measured in weeks, coal reserves in days. The western garrisons had enough ammunition, but that didn't matter if the civilians they were supposed to protect froze and starved. By closing railways and cutting power, Stalin had not just challenged the rights of the Allies in Berlin. He had placed a gun to the head of 2.5 million people and dared Truman to do something about it. On paper, Truman had every right to smash through the blockade. The agreements made in 1945 guaranteed the Western Allies access to Berlin by designated highways, rail lines, and air corridors. American generals could point to the documents and say, "If our convoys are blocked, we send tanks." Simple as that. Some in the Pentagon argued exactly that. Assemble an armored column, drive it up the Autobahn toward Berlin, and dare the Soviets to fire the first shot. But everyone knew what that gamble really meant. This was 1948, not 1914. Both sides were now nuclear powers in the making, and the memory of a world war that had ended only 3 years earlier was still raw. If Soviet troops opened fire on an American convoy, could Washington really afford to back down? If U.S. bombers hit Soviet positions to protect their soldiers, could Moscow afford not to respond? A local clash over a road access dispute risked spiraling into something far worse: a Third World War, this time with strategic bombing and atomic weapons. From the very beginning, there was another problem. The West was not yet locked together in a formal military alliance. NATO would only be created in 1949. In mid-1948, France was exhausted. Britain was nearly bankrupt, and much of Western Europe was still digging itself out of the rubble. Few governments were eager to tell their people, "We may be going back to war over Berlin." In that climate, one miscalculation on an East German road could shatter European confidence in American judgment. Truman understood that if he marched tanks toward Berlin and lost his nerve halfway, U.S. credibility would be destroyed. If he pushed through and the Soviets fought, millions could die. Yet doing nothing, accepting the blockade and walking away, would quietly tell the world that Soviet pressure worked and American promises did not. Between triggering a cataclysm and swallowing humiliation, the president needed something else, something that looked almost impossible: a way to hold Berlin without firing a shot and without giving Stalin a pretext to start a war. Truman's advisors kept searching for a third option, something between surrender and Armageddon. But nothing made sense until General Lucius D. Clay, the tough, plain-spoken commander in Germany, proposed what sounded like a logistical hallucination. If roads, rails, and rivers were closed, then supply the city entirely by air. Feed 2.5 million people using cargo planes. Replace every truck with a C-47. Turn the skies over Germany into a conveyor belt of life. No one in Washington believed it could work. Berlin needed at least 5,000 tons of food, coal, and medicine every single day just to stay alive. Far more than any air transport operation in history had ever attempted. Coal alone seemed impossible. How do you fly in thousands of tons of dirty black rock through narrow air corridors in rain, darkness, and fog without losing planes and crews? Veterans of the European Air War remembered how easily bad weather could ground entire wings. The airfields in Berlin, Tempelhof, and Gottow were already stretched thin. In winter, they froze. In autumn, they drowned in fog. Even in summer, low cloud could push pilots into near-blind landings. Clay didn't pretend the plan was safe. He only insisted it was possible. And, more importantly, it allowed the West to hold Berlin without firing a single shot. Truman listened. Then he said the sentence that set the tone for the entire crisis. "We stay in Berlin. We are not leaving. No shouting, no theatrics, just the calm finality of a man who had made up his mind." Within hours, orders went out. The United States launched Operation Vittles. The British launched Operation Plainfare. C-47 Dakotas and larger C-54 Skymasters were pulled from every available theater. Pilots were recalled from leave. Mechanics slept in hangars to keep aircraft flying around the clock. On June 26, 1948, just 2 days after Stalin sealed the city, the first American transport plane descended into Tempelhof, its wheels touching the runway with sacks of flour strapped inside. That single landing was the start of one of the most audacious humanitarian gambles of the entire Cold War. It was risky, improvised, and mathematically insane. But it carried Truman's signature, a refusal to abandon people who depended on America, and a willingness to confront Stalin without ever giving him an excuse to shoot. The Berlin airlift had begun, and the world was about to watch a silent war fought with cargo manifests instead of artillery. The first few weeks proved just how brutal that gamble would be. Early on, the airlift barely scraped together a couple thousand tons a day, enough to keep Berlin from collapsing, but not enough to make anyone in Moscow nervous. So the Americans and British did something very unglamorous and very American. They treated the whole operation like a factory problem. Every step was measured, timed, and refined. How long to unload a C-54? How many men to roll the coal out? How fast could a pilot turn around and take off again? By autumn 1948, the airlift no longer looked like an emergency stunt. It looked like an assembly line in the sky. New procedures cut unloading times to minutes. Ground crews worked under floodlights. German civilians volunteered to haul sacks, sweep runways, fix pallets, anything to shave seconds off. A third airfield, Tegel, was carved out of rubble and marshland in the French sector in the record time. Built largely by Berliners with hand tools and sheer stubbornness. The numbers exploded. By December 1948, the Western Allies were mounting around 1,400 flights every single day into the city. At the peak, a plane was landing or taking off in Berlin roughly every 30 seconds, day and night, in rain, wind, sleet, and fog. The sky over the city filled with the steady drone of engines. American C-47s and larger C-54 Skymasters, British Yorks, and Dakotas. Shuttling endlessly along the narrow air corridors agreed in 1945. Pilots joked that they were no longer flying individual missions. They were just bolts in a giant machine. Many slept in their seats between legs, grabbing a few minutes of rest while ground crews swarmed around the aircraft. Some made 3, 4, even 5 round trips a day, so familiar with the approach to Tempelhof or Gatow that they could almost fly it with their eyes closed, though they never dared. Each load seemed tiny, measured against the hunger of a whole city, but together the tonnage climbed. Coal for power plants, flour for bakeries, salt, medicine, machine parts. The airlift had turned into a relentless race against time, weather, and Soviet hopes that the West would simply run out of patience or fuel. Instead, the tempo kept rising, and so did Berlin's chances of survival. Yet, amid all the grinding logistics and roaring engines, the most unforgettable moment of the airlift came not from a general or a president, but from a quiet American pilot with a camera around his neck. During a rare break on the ground, Lieutenant Gale Halvorsen wandered over to the fence at Tempelhof and found a group of Berlin children standing there. Thin, polite, curious, and determined not to beg. They told him they didn't want food from him. They simply wanted freedom, something no plane could deliver. Touched by their calm dignity, Halvorsen reached into his pockets, found 2 sticks of gum, tore them into pieces, and watched the children share them, literally passing around the wrappers to smell the sweetness. On the spot, he made a promise. The next time he flew over Berlin, he would drop candy for them. "How will we know which plane is yours?" one child asked. Halvorsen smiled. "I'll wiggle my wings." That tiny gesture became a legend. Before each approach, Halvorsen rocked his C-54 from side to side. Children below would shout, point, and scatter as small parachutes made from handkerchiefs drifted down. Bundles of chocolate, gum, and sweets tied with string. Word spread. Soon, newspapers were calling him the Candy Bomber, and even Uncle Wiggly Wings of Berlin. American schoolchildren mailed candy to Germany. Air crews donated their rations. Berliners began writing letters thanking the strangers who gave their kids something they hadn't tasted in years: joy. What Halvorsen did had no effect on the tonnage charts pinned in the airlift command centers. Yet it changed everything that numbers could not measure. In a city scarred by famine, bomb craters, and political fear, a handful of chocolate bars drifted down like symbols of a different future, one in which the West was not an occupying army but a lifeline. His small parachutes became icons of hope in the earliest, coldest phase of the Cold War, and for Stalin, the optics were a nightmare. How do you crush a city when your rival is dropping candy to its children? The Berlin airlift was proving not just the strength of American logistics, but the power of American humanity. By early 1949, the blockade was no longer the trap Stalin had imagined. It was turning into an embarrassment. The tonnage charts told the story he didn't want to read. Week after week, the airlift not only survived, it improved. Coal deliveries climbed. Food arrivals stabilized. Berliners who were supposed to buckle under pressure instead rallied around the Western powers. The very act meant to break their will was hardening it. Worse for Moscow, the global narrative was slipping out of Stalin's hands. The world was watching American and British planes dropping life-saving supplies and candy into a city the Soviets were trying to freeze into submission. Instead of discrediting the West, the blockade was making the Soviets look like the villains of the new era. diplomatically, the pressure was rising too. Western unity, rather than cracking, was solidifying. In Washington, London, and Paris, the airlift had become a symbol of resolve. In Western Europe, it fueled support for a collective defense pact that would soon become NATO. Stalin found himself boxed in by his own strategy. If he escalated, if he tried to interfere with the air corridors agreed upon in 1945, he risked a direct clash with the United States, something even he didn't want. But if he continued the blockade, he only strengthened Truman's position and further alienated the Berlin population he hoped to win over. After 11 months, it was clear the blockade was not forcing the West out of Berlin. It was anchoring them there. So, before dawn on May 12, 1949, without ceremony or apology, Soviet authorities reopened the roads, railways, and waterways into West Berlin. The blockade was over. Yet the airlift did not stop. Truman and Clay kept it running until September 30, 1949, building up reserve stocks so the city would never again be held hostage by a flick of Stalin's wrist. When the final tallies were made, the Western Allies had flown more than 277,000 missions and delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies, proving, in the most literal way imaginable, that Stalin had lost this battle of wills long before he admitted defeat. The sky had beaten the blockade, the West had held Berlin, and Truman had earned one of the quietest yet most consequential victories of the Cold War. The end of the blockade did more than turn the lights back on in Berlin. It rewired the entire map of post-war Europe. The Berlin airlift became the first clear Western victory of the Cold War, a showdown in which the United States and its allies had faced down Stalin without firing a single shot. That mattered enormously. For a war-weary Europe, the sight of American and British planes risking fog, ice, and accidents day after day told a simple story. These were not occupiers waiting for an excuse to leave. They were partners willing to pay a price to stay. Confidence that had been shaky in 1945 to 46 hardened into trust. Politically, the airlift helped push Western governments toward something that had seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier: a permanent peacetime military alliance. In April 1949, while the airlift was still underway, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating what would soon be known as NATO, a collective security pact built on the idea that an attack on one was an attack on all. The lesson of Berlin was woven into its DNA. Stand together, and Soviet pressure can be resisted. Inside Germany, the lines also sharpened. In 1949, the Western zones formally became the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, anchored economically to the Marshall Plan and politically to the Western Alliance. In response, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in their zone. The division of Germany and of Europe was now not just an occupation arrangement, it was a long-term reality. And at the center of this new order stood Harry Truman, the once dismissed compromise choice from Missouri, now widely seen as the man with steel in his spine. The Berlin airlift didn't make him popular in every poll, but among historians, it would come to be remembered as his finest hour, the moment an unglamorous president quietly proved he could outwit a dictator. In the end, the Berlin airlift stands as one of those rare moments when power was measured not in divisions and warheads, but in sacks of flour and chocolate bars drifting from the sky. A ruined city that had helped start the deadliest war in history was kept alive not by conquest, but by mercy. Day and night, the air over Berlin hummed with transport planes. On the ground, children craned their necks to spot the wiggle of Gail Halverson's wings. And far away in Washington, a plain, bespectacled president refused to sign the order that would have let Berlin die quietly in the dark. Harry Truman was never a grand strategist in the way historians like to romanticize. He was a former farmer and haberdasher who believed stubbornly that a promise meant something, that abandoning Berlin would mean abandoning every small nation caught between empires, and with it, the very idea of a free world. His answer to Stalin was not a brilliant new doctrine. It was simply staying put, paying the cost, and trusting that decency could be a form of strength. That is why the airlift still speaks to us today, long after the runways have gone quiet. So, as you watch those grainy black and white images, endless planes, thin faces at barbed wire, tiny parachutes of candy falling through the clouds, ask yourself this. If you were in Truman's chair, with Stalin's blockade choking a city of 2.5 million people, would you pull your troops out and cut your losses? Or would you gamble everything on the crazy path he chose and try to save Berlin from the sky?